So for most of the early modern period, masturbation was referred to as onanism, and it was described as something that wasn't good for you and you shouldn't do it. You find it referred to in ancient Greek texts as well. Like there is a very old history of concern about masturbation. In the 19th century, it becomes hysterical. Doctors become very worried about children masturbating. You must stop them. And they thought that it would make people impotent. They thought it would lead to the decline of nations because men wouldn't be able to produce sperm. They really had a very catastrophic view of it. But it was more or less the same object. So even as the name for it changed and the emphasis placed on it shifted, it was still the same thing they were talking about. It's recognizable.
It's just funny, you know, I watched, you watch sci-fi movies and you see the apocalypse, you know, apocalyptic movies, and it's like World War III, nuke bombs. I just imagine the future, a future where people are like, yeah, civilization collapsed because everyone was masturbating.
I can't think of any more human activity than conducting science experiments.
The game I play is a very interesting one. It's imagination in a tight straitjacket.
The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together.
What I always think should be the basis of education is not answers, but questions. We should teach kids how to question.
Thank you for being on the podcast, Alison. We heard you at the research showcase and we thought that your work is really fascinating. And you have an interesting journey as well. I think you're talking about how you have a foot in both the humanities and as well as the STEM field. You've had some biomedical training. But could you just give us a background of who you are and also what you're currently doing, just briefly, so that our guests actually know who we have on? Because sometimes we've gone on and had like a 5-minute conversation. We're like, oh yeah, by the way, this is so-and-so.
Yeah, okay. Well, I probably began like pretty much a conventional humanities person. I did an arts degree with a major in history and did a PhD in history, and I was always interested in the history of medical thought, but it didn't really occur to me, I think, as a young scholar, that I should try to understand any of those disciplines in their own terms, funnily enough. And you find actually that's not uncommon in the humanities, even with people who do medical history. And there just came a point where I felt like I should probably understand this from the inside out instead of just looking at it as a historical object. And I talked to a bunch of people and I thought about it for a long time, and a lot of my colleagues were saying, well, you don't have to go and study it. You can just read scientific research articles. You can just educate yourself. But you don't.
Yeah. It's always a lot faster when you have a teacher as well.
Yeah. Well, the fact is I was also interested in university pedagogy and other disciplines, and I was interested in that experience of induction, like what it is to feel like you're being drawn into a discipline and exposed to it in a systematic way. And then as I began, finally having decided to do that study, and as I began it, I had absolutely no doubt that that was the right way to go, because then you realise that if you don't do a systematic study, you just follow your own interests and you end up with this little kind of interesting marginal path, but you don't have a sense of the larger context. Like you do actually have to learn some things that you're not inherently drawn to to see where things fit. And
sometimes like following your interest, it's great, but you might miss really foundational stuff that would blind you to certain things that experts in the field are well aware of. That's interesting. So what got you interested in history? We've never had a historian before. So, and my dad's actually was a history lecturer at university back in Afghanistan before we left. Yeah, so his focus was on the Mongolian invasion in Afghanistan, but its effect in Asia more widely. But yeah, and he's always been fascinated by them. We always get into interesting conversations. But I'm curious, what inspired you to get into history?
I think it really started when I was about 8, and I borrowed this kit from the local library that was about the plague and fire of London, and I realised I was fascinated by diseases, but always in this historical context. So I was fascinated by diseases of the past, specifically, and so that was really the first time I got really drawn into some sort of medical history question, like as an 8-year-old.
What do you think fascinated you about diseases in particular?
At such a young age as well,
It's hard to say. I think it was just, I don't know. I mean, there's a sense, I guess, in which we try to create an environment that is all very positive, and it's all about what's good and working and happy and healthy, and that's what you try to give kids, right? Because you don't want them to have bad dreams or... but actually the fact that I was given that upbringing, it doesn't affect everyone this way, but for me it just made me go, what else is there? What about the stuff that's not good? I want to know about that. So I wanted to know about evil, I wanted to know about disease, I wanted to know about death. It just was always interesting to me because it wasn't the thing people were talking about.
I think as far as humanities subjects go, history's promotes a lot of curiosity, because we actually gave a presentation to some high school kids to try and inspire them to get into science. And one of the things we're like telling them is, scientists are really curious people. But I didn't do science for the HSC myself, but I did do history and 3-unit modern history, which I bombed out in. But that's a different story. But I loved 2-unit and got right into it. And I think that was because I always had this like natural curiosity. I was always interested in science and things like that as well. So was it possibly, were you always a curious child?
Yeah,
or?
Incredibly.
Yeah,
I sort of devoured all kinds of things as a kid, and just read enormous amounts of books and so. And then when I was a teenager, I got into left-wing politics, and I joined a Trotskyist group.
Yeah.
And they sent us to this cater training school, which is a thing that doesn't exist anymore as far as I know.
Yeah.
It was in Dulwich Hill. It was a share house, and you had to go there you could go for either 3 or 6 months. I did 6, and you lived in a commune. And what we had to do every day, there was a set reading of Marxist theory and philosophy and history.
Wow.
And it was a lot. It was like 200 pages of reading per day.
Wow.
Jeez.
And then a couple of times a week we had this extremely brilliant, erudite, working class man who was a party sort of top leader. He would come and grill us on it.
Yeah.
And he was absolutely had no sense of social understanding. Like he didn't know eye contact. He didn't really know how to relate to us at all. But he was fantastic.
Yeah.
He was really smart and just a lovely guy in a funny way as well. And so I did that for 6 months, and then I thought, maybe I'll go to university. And so, reading about, I think, the French Revolution, reading about the Russian Revolution, reading about the rise of these ideological movements in the 20th century, that really switched me on to modern European history, which is what I ended up specialising in. But then I went to university and I thought, wow, this is really easy. What we've been through is excruciating.
Right,
It's
you went
really
from
hard.
200 pages a day to like 200 pages a semester probably.
Yeah, so I just never had that experience that so many of my students have where they feel like the reading's too much.
Right.
I always just felt like, wow, what else is there? Because I'm used to more than this.
That's interesting, that connection between history and politics, because I had a very similar thing. I remember getting into like pretty left-wing politics in my teenage years as well, and probably as a direct result of the study of modern history, because we in high school, and that's the extent of my historical study, but we did the Russian Revolution and even went into the Chinese Revolution and things as well. So you get exposed to a lot of that, and I think when you're starting to question the world at that particular age and like questioning the way the politics in your own society works, that it's kind of the stage is set to introduce those kind of different ideas. Yeah.
It was a pretty strange time for me to be a left-wing militant, because it was in the context of the collapse of the East European communist states and Gorbachev and all that.
Right.
So it was like we still had all the Cold War discourse of like communism's evil. Why would you want that? And then we also had this like incredibly celebratory, now it's over and it didn't work. See, and in there I was like, yeah, communism.
That's so interesting.
So that lasted a couple of years, and then I just felt like I was sick of having the answers. You know, I was 18. I felt like really I'm too young to know what's best for society. I just want to go and study stuff.
That's interesting because most people at the age of 18 love having the answers and
I've
pretend
been
like
doing it for 3 years.
Fair enough. So you matured really early.
Well, yeah. I just I'd had exposed to me on a few occasions just how little I really understood. And yeah, I just felt like I needed to not pretend to have the answers. I need to know more.
I think you're right, because I had a similar turnaround as well. Like I don't.
Not at 18, dude.
Later. Yeah, much later. No, trust me. Yeah, no, he's right. He's right.
A couple of years ago, man. Don't pretend you were so wise.
But no, I was. Yeah, you kind of like, it seems like an easy answer, right? Those real harsh left-wing things. And but it's obviously, as you learn more, it's not quite as simple. And when you're comparing these two, the capitalist and the communist kind of ideologies, they both have, I think, for me, positives and negatives now, looking back at it. And it's not quite as simple as this one's always the better one. Yeah.
There's a lot of
you have that turnaround,
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance. And I think with the beauty of history is that these experiments have been run so many times. And you can draw lessons from it, and you can see that when ideas go really extreme, what happens. You know, there's a really good podcast I listen to, Hardcore History by Dan Carlin, and he has this quote where he says, "History is the autobiography of a madman." It's so interesting, you know, because you see some of the most extreme things happening in the past, and it's many times it's more interesting than fiction. You know? So going back to your story, so you had this realization that you wanted to learn more, and so what did you do with that realization?
I just enrolled in an arts degree. I started studying history and learned languages, and just got addicted, really.
So an arts degree is, for people that don't know, is a very open degree, isn't it? So
absolutely, yes. Lots of things you could do in that.
Yeah. How did you pick? Obviously, you have to pick a major.
Yeah, I was a bit torn.
What major did you do?
I started at the University of Wollongong, and so there were some things I already knew I wanted to do that weren't available. So I didn't study philosophy, which I was interested in, but I did get to study history and learn French and Italian. So I was pretty happy with my degree. But I could have done literature studies. I probably could have even taken psychology units in the arts degree. There's all sorts of things you can do in arts.
Yeah. Were you drawn to French and Italian because you were interested in their history in particular?
Yeah. I was very much interested in the history of Europe. That was what I wanted to know about. And frankly, there weren't that many possibilities of what I could study. So, most of the expertise at that university at that time was more European, or it was Australian.
Right.
Or there was an emerging expertise in Asian studies as well, but East Asian. So, there were not that many options. And, in terms of language study, I actually would have loved to have learnt German, but it wasn't available at that time.
Right.
I'm still trying to learn German. Repeated attempts over the years.
I only know one word, Dankeschön.
That's a good one to know.
My wife's Austrian, but I don't speak German, but I know a few rude words.
It's interesting. Whichever language you pick up, generally you pick up the rude words really quickly and really early on.
I just learned them so I could embarrass her.
Formal parties.
Yeah.
You mean Austrians?
Yeah.
Oh, that's hilarious. Okay, so you did this arts degree, but what led you into research?
Well, I just always was. I always did like writing and reading. That was just I was never the sort of person who was going to enter academia and then not want to do research. It just wasn't going to happen. And so then after I finished my PhD, I was very fortunate. I had a temporary lectureship at Sydney Uni And then from there I went straight into a 4-year postdoc.
Oh, wow.
So that really kicked me off in a big way. I think if I'd had to go through that pathway that a lot of young academics do, where they're in fairly heavy teaching roles for many years straight after their PhD, probably I wouldn't have the kind of track record that I do. It's much harder to build in that context.
Well, what did you do for your PhD? Did you have what was your research?
So my thesis was about the history of ideas about perversion in psychiatric and social hygienist thought. Europe of the late 19th and 20th centuries.
So at that stage, you're already kind of interested in, I guess, health and the sciences. And
history of psychiatry especially. Yeah, so a lot of my work has been in that area.
Was that by accident, or because you said as you were younger you were interested in history of diseases? So does it kind of stem from there, or?
I don't think so. I think it was more. I was interested in how we came to think that certain sexual practices were perverse and others weren't. I wanted to know where that idea had come from. And I dug around and I realized, okay, this is really a story about the late 19th century and it's about psychiatrists.
Yeah.
So it sort of was how I ended up there rather than really being motivated toward psychiatry.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about that? Can you just unpack what you just said?
Oh, right, okay. So
why is the history of what the different beliefs we have about sexual practices, why is that linked to psychiatry? Where does it come from?
Yeah, in the 19th century in particular. You said.
Yeah, it seems to have started around in the 1850s. There were people tossing around these ideas that there were particular forms of madness that were somehow sexual. And one of the earliest iterations of that idea was the notion that if you looked at dictators and violent people like Genghis Khan or like Gilles de Rais, the guy who persecuted Joan of Arc, if you'd find these historical figures, what you'd find in them is some particular sort of perversion of their sexual drive that makes them cruel. So that was one of the first ideas about it. That was
so the cruelty was driven by the sexual underlying sexual perversion.
And this idea has had a very long history. There have been many forms of people making the claim, and there's just no evidence. There's no evidence that sex is responsible for anyone's cruelty.
So is it the puritanical values that people had back then?
No, it's kind of the opposite in a way. It's like they were reacting against a whole understanding of sex as given by God or given by nature, and they were looking instead at they were really interested in the idea that civilization sort of perverts us. And they also believed, of course, throughout the second half of the 19th century, as evolutionary thought became more and more distributed throughout all these different disciplines, people were speculating about whether societies evolve. And they thought that particular sexual practices might map to the different stages of social evolution.
Sorry, I was just trying to fix that. Just trying to.
No worries.
Yeah, could you just repeat that last sentence? Sorry.
Yeah, so this idea emerged that there are particular sexual practices that belong with specific stages of social evolution.
So interesting.
So we get this idea that primitive people, and I think they were mostly referring to hunter-gatherer cultures, they thought that they wouldn't have any perversions. But they would also have an excess of sexual activity. They'd just be going for it all the time.
So this is the idea of the noble savage.
It's a variation of that, I guess. So yeah, they did see them somewhat benevolent, but also as unrestrained. And they really thought that there had to be some sort of sexual restraint to create civilization. And this idea became famous, of course, in Freudian thought. The idea that we have to sublimate our desire in order to create all these masterworks of society.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So do they have different stages and different sexual activities or associated to those stages?
Yeah. So then they thought that after being primitive, human cultures passed through a barbarous stage. And they considered all of the despotic regimes of the past as barbarous, signs of barbarism. They particularly singled out one of their contemporary regimes, the Ottoman Empire, as a symbol of barbarism. So there's a whole is a whole articulation of the idea of the Ottomans as sexually perverse and degraded, and that's where you have this big European discourse about Islamic societies being pederastic.
What does that mean?
Into boys.
Oh, okay.
The men are into boys.
Right.
This is a whole interesting thing in itself. We'll come back to if you want, because
Yeah.
I've been reading about this a lot lately, and it's very, very interesting.
Well, that's what that's what I was going to ask. Does that still happen today to an extent?
That we characterise other cultures?
Others by, like...
Sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
Deviant sexual behaviour, because you see that a lot. Yeah.
Right.
Particularly with all of the gay marriage issue and things that have just been coming in Australia, and what's going on in America right now and things like that, with transgender rights and things like this. It's not, I guess, nation states, but still kind of exists, I think, doesn't it? That attitude.
Yeah, it's changed.
Yeah.
There's a different game being played now, I think. We can come back to some of those questions, though, because they are. I have.
Hamid did warn us at the start
about
that there'd be too much to talk about.
The whole intersex transgender thing is something I think a lot about at the moment as well. It's very interesting to me from a historical perspective. But yeah, so we have this idea that you have the primitives who are just sort of going for it all the time. They don't have any perversions, but it's only when they start to put on clothes and restrain themselves that they can build anything. Then we have this barbarous stage. And the barbarians, Europeans thought were most likely to be cruel, that was where we would see this thing they now are calling sadism. So they thought that sadism was part of our evolution. It was normal, but that we had to overcome it to become civilized.
Right. Okay, so tell us a little bit more about sadism, I suppose.
Well, so obviously the inspiration for that word was the figure of the Marquis de Sade, who was a French libertine around the time of the French Revolution, who wrote many books, many books of pornographic fantasy about actually all sorts of things. So it's funny in a way that they picked Sade to represent sexual cruelty, because if you read his books, he's into it being flipped. He's into all sorts of violations of moral codes and religious taboos. And he was just an extremely exploratory, provocative person. But so they named sadism after him.
Right.
And towards the end of the 19th century, there were a bunch of different psychiatrists in various countries. So you have a major Austrian figure called Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who wrote a very famous book called Psychopathia Sexualis. Lots of it in Latin, so that ordinary people couldn't read it. And it describes all these perversions that have suddenly got new names. So there's a very imaginative invention of these categories of pathology at the end of the 19th century.
It's interesting, because that kind of leads on to what your discussion was when we first met you at the research week we had here at Western Sydney, and you were saying about menopause, and that was. So is that what you're currently working on?
Yeah,
so
that's the new
because that's
project.
very similar. It's like you were making the argument that it was somewhat of an invented pathology.
Well, it's very clear that the words get invented in a particular moment, right? You can track that quite precisely. There is no word menopause before 1812, and suddenly there's a word. And it isn't always the case that new concepts appear with those words. Sometimes we find that new words appear, but they correlate very closely with some past terminology. They don't appear to have substantially changed. This is true of masturbation, for example. So for most of the early modern period, masturbation was referred to as onanism. And it was described as something that wasn't good for you and you shouldn't do it. You find it referred to in ancient Greek texts as well. Like, there is a very old history of concern about masturbation. In the 19th century, it becomes hysterical. Doctors become very worried about children masturbating. You must stop them. And they thought that it would make people impotent. They thought it would lead to the decline of nations because men wouldn't be able to produce sperm. They really had a very catastrophic view of it. But it was more or less the same object. So even as the name for it changed and the emphasis placed on it shifted, it was still the same thing they were talking about. Right. It's recognizable.
It's just funny, you know, I watched, you watch sci-fi movies and you see the apocalypse, you know, apocalyptic movies, and it's like World War III, nuke bombs. I just imagine the future future where people are like, yeah, civilization collapsed because everyone was masturbating too many.
Yeah.
Everyone was masturbating too much.
Yeah, it seems pretty laughable to us now, but they're
Yeah.
dead serious. And they thought it was a real problem. But it's interesting, even when you find what I love as a historian is when you go through all these archival documents. I'm reading a lot of 19th century medical theses on the menopause topic, and they mostly are parroting the same line, right? They're all reading each other, and they get this sort of fashionable, sort of groupthink, and everyone starts talking the same way. But occasionally you come across one who is just like, what's this rubbish? And they completely disagree, and they seem so incredibly rational. And you realise, wow, they really, when you characterise the past, you always have to be careful to look at that variation, because it's like now. You could go to lots of doctors, for example, and think, wow, that guy's an idiot, he doesn't know anything. And then you could also find clinicians that just blow you away with how up to date they keep with the research literature and how good their patient care is. And so there's massive variation always in the level of intelligence and the quality of attention that people give to things.
So menopause, fill
us in a little bit on that.
So prior to that time, it didn't really have a basis. Like there wasn't any prior sort of concept of it.
No.
Yeah, because you're saying some words get invented, but the concept has always been there. So is that the same with menopause? Or?
Yeah, no, menopause is quite different because there really wasn't a term that meant the same thing prior to the invention of that word. What you had were a bunch of terms that were not specific to women. So it was thought that both men and women suffered a kind of critical age. This is what it was referred to as a critical age, or in English they called it the climacteric. And this idea came from fairly ancient notions of the life being divided up into cycles. So in Roman medical thought, it was considered that the life cycle appeared in 7-year blocks, and that in the transition between those blocks, you would be more vulnerable to disease. And so the critical age was this idea that both men and women reaching around 50 would suddenly find old illnesses recurring, and they would need to be more careful with their health. So that was the concept that existed. And then you have a bunch of French doctors after the French Revolution who are absolutely enamoured with science, and they see it very much as something with which to batter religion. That is very much their Republican atheist sort of perspective. And so they come up with this term menopause, because they want to insist that it is not a pathology, it is just the cessation of menstruation. And so then they start referring to it as very specifically just women who have it, and they try to describe it in this very matter-of-fact way that doesn't pathologise it. So the term, that's their argument for it. But then they have this whole list of terrible symptoms, and they actually elaborate the whole symptomatology as it's never been elaborated before. So all of that description of the things that will go wrong is new in that moment. And
so the Romans thought that this critical age, there's certain you're more predisposed to diseases because that's that transition phase, right? And they associated to that phase, whereas in Europe, much later on, they thought, okay, well, it's not a pathology necessarily. This is an age where a woman can't produce, is no longer fertile, but these are the symptoms associated to that critical time.
It's difficult to understand because it doesn't make sense.
No,
it's contradictory. So this is one of the difficult things doing historical work, and I always try to reassure my students about this too, that sometimes we study things that are never iterated in such a way as to be logically consistent, and that's your object. That's what you're trying to write a history of. So you can't resolve those problems. Those problems are inherent to the logic of the thing itself. All you can do is explain. This is what they were saying. It doesn't make sense.
So there seems to be some cognitive dissonance at play while they were coming up with this. Okay, so in cultures that don't have the concept of menopause, how does that affect the health of people.
Yeah,
brought
this
up
is
in
very
those-
interesting because actually some of the early French doctors who were working on the topic, they, of course, most people in France at the end of the 18th century lived in the countryside. They lived in either very small villages or on farms. And they didn't necessarily have access to doctors. But some of the doctors, in wanting to know about menopause, decided they would go out and interview peasant women. So they'd go out to the countryside and they'd find women and they'd ask them, how did you experience the end of your menses? And those women were completely baffled by the question. They're like, well, nothing, it just stopped. And they'd ask them, well, was it a good thing or a bad thing? They'd say, yeah, it's good. Like, I don't have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah.
And, I've had enough babies, and I don't want any more, and now I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
No more periods. It's good.
So all these symptoms that they didn't experience that had been identified,
Right.
were kind of invented, or
Well, okay. This is a complicated question.
Yeah.
And there's another angle of it too, which is that, there's some work done by anthropologists looking at what happens to people when they migrate from a society where there isn't a concept of menopause and where they are also kind of more on the edge of towns in the countryside. And then they move to big urban centres. So there's a wonderful anthropologist at Cambridge called Mwenza Blel who writes about Pakistani Muslims migrating to London. And she's interviewed a whole bunch of these women before they migrated and after. And she's interviewed them about menopause. And there's a very interesting shift in their perspective that happens once they're exposed to the concept.
Yeah.
But they're also exposed to a very different set of life ways.
Right.
So I'm being quite careful here because I don't think actually... I mean, there's no doubt that concepts are powerful.
Right.
But when you're talking about things that are to do with bodies, you have to at least also consider that the pressures on those bodies has changed.
Yeah.
Right? This is an obvious thing to consider. And the fact is that a lot of the people moving from the countryside to towns at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution had a fundamental change to the life ways of their bodies, in that suddenly they were not out in the fresh air. They were not living according to the diurnal cycle. They were under a sort of a pressure of industrial ways of organising work. They were struggling to get enough to eat, so their quality of life deteriorated in many respects. And in terms of the elites, what was happening is increasingly they were living a very sedentary existence. And you get this idea emerging in the 19th century that women should really be very careful not to do anything very much physically. And doctors were prescribing this to women. They would say to them, definitely no vigorous exercise of any kind, maybe a very slow, gentle walk at the most.
Yeah.
In terms of exercise that they did recommend, or a ride in a carriage.
Wow.
They considered that to be exercise.
Sitting.
Yeah, so the fact is that probably, in terms of what we know about menopause symptomatology from recent research, there's absolutely no doubt that being sedentary is a factor for elevated symptoms.
That's interesting. Can I just ask, that this might be a dumb question, but can you just tell us some of the symptoms, most typical symptoms associated with menopause?
Well, it depends when you ask the question. Because, now what you find is people talk about hot flushes, dysregulation of mood and sleep, loss of sexual desire, bloating, gastrointestinal problems, headaches, things like that. Hot flushes are probably the top one. If you go back to the early 19th century, you find a very different set of symptoms. And doctors were much more describing things along the lines of massive uterine hemorrhages, was the thing they reported frequently. There was no mention of hot flushes really until probably the late 19th century, but initially that wasn't one of the symptoms they described. And the thing that interests me, having done a lot of work in the history of sexuality, is they never talked about women losing their sexual desire as they got older. That was not what they were saying. They were saying that women were more likely to be nymphomaniacs as they got older, and that both men and women were more likely to be perverse.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So the definition of the symptoms it seems to change across time, which kind of lends credence to the idea that it must be something to do with their lifestyle.
It could be that. It could be that. So there is one of the menopause scholars who's done a little bit of historical work noted that at the end of the 18th century, people were very commonly using purgative medications. They were circulating widely. People would just dose themselves with these, elixirs that would give them hemorrhages, for example. So it's possible that there were women who didn't expect that their menses should stop, and so they would take those medications to try and make it start again. This has been the thing that's the thing that doctors at the time thought was happening. That was what they were reporting. But
could it also be cultural then? I'm guessing as well. So there's obviously a large cultural component to it, because you mentioned before women moving from Pakistan to Europe or England. Has there been much research on that, like different cultural experiences?
So that's what I'm saying about the concept about trying to judge how much power it might have, because if you think that there is this thing that's going to happen to you, I mean, there's a lot of research in neuropsychology on what they call anticipatory activation of sensory experience. And there's a huge amount of work in the area of neuropsychology of pain that is about that as well. That if you expect to have pain, if you expect to have symptoms, you can give them to yourself. I mean, this is like the nocebo thing, right? You get two groups of people, give them the same food, and you tell one of them this food's really bad for you. You can measure very interesting markers of inflammation that don't occur in the other group.
It just seems to me that it's strange that, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe it has been researched, but maybe that hasn't been researched very much at all. You'd think that would be of interest to doctors and the medical industry to see cultural distinctions between how women go through menopause.
There is work on that. That's what I'm describing, that anthropological work. There's actually a whole journal of menopause studies. That is one of the main things that it publishes on.
It's very interesting.
I've always looked at medicine as almost like shamanism in a way. It's like it's probably a weird way of describing it, but it's like doctors have to put on like almost like an act. They're wearing white coats because there's a huge psychological aspect to medicines actually working. So if you take a medication and you don't believe it works, like that's gonna depreciate its effects. And usually medications, I've heard this, that they work better once people start to notice the side effects. They're like, oh, this is working, and then all of a sudden it becomes really effective.
Right.
That's really interesting. So you did a history of, so you've combined history with medical science.
No, the medical stuff I did much later.
So tell us about that. So what did that entail?
Okay, well, at the time I was working at another institution. I won't name that.
You can name them.
Well, I wasn't very happy there. I was teaching not in history. I was teaching in another discipline. It wasn't exactly what I wanted to be doing. And looking around at how few academic jobs there were available for historians, I thought maybe I need to think about retraining. So I actually thought initially that to go back to university and do a biomedical science degree and create a path toward being some sort of science researcher. That was my original idea.
Wow.
And then, so I enrolled in a biomedical science degree at UNE by distance, and I'd go there and do their, they had these, what do they call them again? Intensives. So instead of doing your lab work throughout the semester, you go and you cram it all into 2 weeks. It's excruciating.
I think they still exist. I think you can do them with Charles Sturt
It's
as well.
very tiring. It's extremely hard. So I did that for a couple of years, and then, but in the midst of it, I got the job here, which I love. Like I'm exactly where I want to be now, and really like my colleagues, and get to teach what I want to teach, and get to have postgrad students. So there were lots of things I was frustrated in my previous job that I'm not frustrated in here. So I'm no longer thinking I need to retrain as something else. And then it was just about, okay, what is interesting here? What can I get out of this from my own research? And it had so stimulated me on so many levels that I didn't regret spending a couple of years doing that study, because I just haven't thought the same way since.
How has it changed your perspective or approach?
Yeah, so it made me think about different questions, and then it's also just made me ask. I mean, that like that question you asked about, there being how am I just saying that the concepts make us experience things like menopause differently? And I said, it's not only that we also have to think about the bodies. Yeah. That kind of line of reasoning, I probably wouldn't have occurred to me even to go down it. And it isn't how most historians think at all. And actually this article, this has just come out, which is really exciting. So that's the first piece of scholarship that I've had published on the menopause topic.
Conceptual layers in the invention of menopause in the 19th century France. And it's just one author.
Oh, yeah, that's very common in the humanities.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
In the science, there'd be 10 names.
10 names. Yeah. Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, we should give that a read. That's interesting.
But the funny thing is, this article, when I submitted it to that journal, there was a whole chunk of it that was about possible physiological reasons why women might have begun to experience menopause differently in the early 19th century compared to how they'd been living previously. And they told me to cut it.
Oh, right. Was it because they thought it wasn't within the scope of the journal?
I think they just saw it as too speculative and just didn't seem to fit the methodology. Like, this is an intellectual history article. Yeah. It's describing how medical thought, developed this concept. And then there was a chunk of it that was about how it could also be explained through the changing life ways of bodies. And that part of it they saw as just not really fitting.
It's interesting.
I was
just going to say, well, that's the beauty of, I suppose, an interdisciplinary approach to this thing, because we've broken knowledge into these infrastructures, along these infrastructures of the university, but in the real world, to really understand or to understand the universe and understand reality, you have to combine all these different disciplines to get a better understanding of what's really happening.
So maybe we should move along to that, because we've already been going for 40 odd minutes or something. Wow. We haven't even got to the main reason why we probably really wanted to have you on, which was marrying like the humanities and the sciences, because I think we both have an interest in that, and that's what part of this podcast is about, is kind of showing like interdisciplinary research and focusing on that. So maybe, like, what do you see as the value? Like, sell it to us. And what do you see as the value? Why is it really important to marry the sciences and the humanities together?
Yeah. Look,
because we've had some guests on. I don't know if you know Kate McBride. Do you know Kate McBride? So she's done. She's an epidemiologist, and she's done some work on why women who are overweight have aversions to going for breast screening exams. And a couple of her, I think, students are now researching things like how the islander populations in Australia, and particularly Western Sydney, have a natural aversion to go on seeking help for diabetes, but it's actually a major problem in their community. So there's these social aspects to how people go and get treated for a disease. So it's all right sitting here as a scientist and going, hey, I've got a great treatment for this disease and we can fix you right up. But if you can't get that treatment to people, or you can't convince populations that have unique kind of characteristics to go and seek that treatment, then the treatment's kind of worthless.
And you get that understanding of those cultural understandings come from the humanities, and without that, you kind of hit like a roadblock.
Yeah. Well, I think the humanities, they also tend to cultivate particular ways of using your brain. So they do rely a lot more on a sort of implicit intelligence, and the path to learning them tends not to be very linear. You tend to sort of approach something from lots of different angles all at once and try to build networks. And so that way of operating cognitively, I think, is incredibly valuable for scientists. I would really like that people undergoing a scientific training have that as well. I think it could be tremendously valuable for their capacity to make connections between things that aren't obvious, and to intuit things that they don't understand why they are drawn to.
That's really interesting. So it's not even like a direct cause and effect, but even just understanding the way that different disciplines think and approach a problem can be valuable.
Yeah. I sort of think of it as just there being, I mean, we know that there are all these different rhythms in the brain, right? So you've also, you've got your really fast firing between neurons, and you've got these magnetic pulsing oscillations that are of different frequencies. It seems like intellectually it's somewhat similar. So we have a very pointed way that we can look at things, and we can be very goal-directed, but we also have these really underlying sort of currents that are almost moving through us like waves, and it's very easy to ignore them. And it seems like mostly we are encouraged to ignore them and just be very goal-directed. And the humanities really are a collection of disciplines that are all about getting you to pay attention more to those undercurrents.
So how would you contrast the STEM fields to that? Is it more like going from A to B to C to D, more linear thinking?
It definitely is, yeah. But it's not necessarily, I think, the best way to even learn those disciplines. I mean, having been a science student, I really wonder about a lot of the pedagogy I see in universities still, where you have to kind of memorize a textbook, basically. That's just not effective. Nobody retains that information learning that way.
I think you're right. There's a distinct lack of problem solving incorporated into scientific teaching, and particularly even in high school as well, because that's where it started. I think I mentioned before I didn't do science for the HSC, and a lot of the reason for that was I went into high school being a really curious student, but then kind of fell out of love with science because it was like you say, you just put a textbook down and you need to know these facts to pass the exam, and I just didn't connect to that, and I just threw the textbook away and just turned off. And it wasn't until later when I kind of realized that science is a way to solve problems, and it's kind of fun to learn something new about the world and to teach it to yourself, and that I really got interested in science again. So I think you're right.
Well, it's interesting because it's, on one hand, you have to know the facts and learn the language game of each discipline. Like biochemistry, a lot of it's rote learning. You have to know what an enzyme is, you have to know what a cofactor is, you have to know these things, and that is tedious and boring shit. But on the other hand, you have to do that in order to start the problem solving, and you have to strike that balance between how do we do this so that students are engaged and are thinking laterally, but also they've accumulated the jargon, the vocabulary necessary to get engaged in this field. So it's definitely tricky.
It's never going to be easy.
No. I wish it was like The Matrix, you could just upload shit.
We're all waiting for that.
No, but then
upload all the facts and keep the thinking.
No, that's actually a good idea. But I was going to say, where's the fun if you don't have that journey of learning?
Well, it can be too. I think that exercise in struggle, where you're trying to just come to grips with a lot of detail and you have to memorize things. I mean, I don't know, I'm not sure at what level it works, but it seems like there's a sort of process that happens as well, isn't there? That sometimes you can have these emergent realizations, having undergone that effort that you would not arrive at otherwise.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is important there, because a lot of people say, I don't see the point of exams. What's the point of exams? I can look stuff up. But for me, the way I justify exams and things is that it's not actually about learning the information. It's about going through the stress, right? Exams are a stressful experience, and it's about dealing with that stress and how you prepare for it, and they're the skills you learn from doing exams. It's not about the facts. Sure, we can all go and check a fact anytime we want.
It's about building the character that you need to have success in the future. And if you don't go through the fire, then
there's an element of that, I guess, too, isn't it? It's work ethic that you build.
Yeah, that's true.
We'd like to think that we can just spontaneously manifest work ethic when we need it, but the fact is, if you haven't practiced it,
it's not that. That's not that simple. We're reaching the end, and it's almost been 50 minutes. So I suppose we should end this with, what are the current research projects you have available? I know you're taking on master's students or PhD students at the moment.
Yeah, definitely always open to HDRs. It's my favorite kind of teaching. So at the moment I'm working on a few things. Obviously the sexual aging project, which is the way I'm sort of describing it, because actually I'm quite interested in the fact that in medical history people have not only thought of it as a female problem. So I don't just want to write a history of menopause, I want to write a history of both men's and women's aging, and then what people start to say about it when they realise there maybe is a third sex. And
Can I, sorry, before you interrupt, a thought came to, before you go on, not interrupt. Has there been any symptoms associated that's analogous to menopause to men in cultures where they think that those symptoms should exist at that critical age?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, even in the early 20th century, there were doctors who were, that's when they coined the term andropause, and they were arguing that actually men have it as well. It's not about menstruation, but it's about some sort of critical age.
Oh, wow, snap. Okay. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
Yeah. So, so it's a history of sexual aging. And, you know, I really want to go up till now. I'm very interested in what's happened to the way we think of it since the rise of hormone replacement therapies. And I need to, I don't know that this is the case, but it seems on the surface as if what might have happened, and I'll have the answer to this probably in the next few years, is that as the scientific knowledge of being able to supplement hormones exogenously emerged after the Second World War, what we have is a change in the concept that sort of tracks along with it, in which we start to think of sexual desire as something that just undergoes a linear decline with age, and particularly for women.
Right. Whereas previously they thought that you become an nymphomaniac.
Right. Yeah. So this is striking, though. It's like kind of the opposite.
Yeah. Okay. So besides that particular project, do you have any other research focuses?
Yeah, so I'm also working on a collaborative project. It's taking some interesting turns. It might be about to turn into something massive. It started out, I've had a long interest in the history of ideas about excrement. And I've published a bit about that earlier on in my career, and then I put it aside, and I always thought to come back to that project and write a book about it. And then out of the blue, I was contacted by a young literary scholar in Scotland who invited me to come and speak at a conference that she'd organised about the histories and cultural expressions in the past of the idea that gut health affects how we feel. And so we put together a book on that, which is coming out later this year. But just today, I've gotten the agreement from a really wonderful gastroenterology researcher in Norway who edits a journal called Microbial Diversity in Health and Disease, who's very much in that microbial ecology branch of gastroenterology. And he's agreed to work with me on a collaboration as well. So
because it's incredibly interesting,
that's
isn't it?
So
yeah.
This is man, that sucks. So we have to limit this conversation.
We'll have to have you on again.
Yeah,
we each other.
Yeah, let's have a guts podcast.
Yeah, we should definitely do that. So if students want to work with you, they can hit you up on Google, look up Dr. Alison Moore.
Absolutely.
And if you can't find her on Google, then you shouldn't do research. So thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We really enjoyed this conversation.
Awesome.